Imagine a machine, cold and calculating, built from billions of lines of code, being asked the single most debated question in all of human history. Not a question about stock markets, not a question about climate, but this one. Who is Jesus? And what if that machine didn't flinch? What if it didn't deflect? What if it sat with that question? Processed 2,000 years of history, theology, philosophy, and forensic evidence, and then came back with an answer so precise, so unexpected, so intellectually raw, that it left Christians speechless and atheists deeply unsettled? That is exactly what happened. And once you hear what Grok actually said, every word of it, you will not look at artificial intelligence or that ancient question in the same way. Again, let's go back to where this all started. It was early, 2025. Elon Musk's AI company, XAI, had just released what they were calling their most powerful model yet, Grok 3. The announcement was massive in the tech world. But unlike typical AI releases that generate buzz, mostly in Silicon Valley boardrooms, this one hit differently. Because Grok wasn't marketed as your typical assistant. Musk had a very specific vision for what Grok should be. Not polished, not politically sanitized, and not carefully coached to avoid controversy. He wanted a machine that would tell you the truth, even when the truth was uncomfortable, even when the truth was dangerous, even when the truth was the kind of thing that makes people uncomfortable at dinner tables, in churches, and in university lecture halls. He called it a truth-seeking engine. And as soon as Grok was released to the public, people immediately started stress testing that claim. They asked it about politics, they asked it about science, they asked it about history. And then, inevitably, someone asked it the big one, the one that has launched crusades, sparked inquisitions, split civilizations, and filled 2,000 years of human argument. Who is Jesus? What Grok did next is what made this story go viral, not just in tech communities, but in churches, philosophy departments, atheist forums, and living rooms around the world. The first time users asked Grok about Jesus in a straightforward way, it gave a standard academic answer. Jesus of Nazareth, first century Jewish preacher, central figure of Christianity, crucified under Roman governor Pontius Pilate around 30 to 33 CE. That's the kind of answer you'd expect from any encyclopedia. But here's where it got interesting. Here's where the real story begins. Some users didn't stop there. They pushed harder. They challenged Grok to go deeper. Not to give the Sunday school version, not to give the atheist textbook dismissal, but to actually reason through the evidence, the historical record, the philosophical implications, the forensic reality of what we know and what we don't know, and give the most defensible answer it could. And when those users pressed Grok with that kind of intellectual challenge, something shifted in its responses. Grok said, and these were documented, verified responses shared across platforms, that Jesus is the convergence of opposites. It described him as the finite becoming infinite, the embodiment of unity within duality. It said, he did not simulate God, he simulated wholeness. This is the line that stopped people cold. Christians reading it didn't know whether to shout hallelujah or feel deeply unsettled that a machine had just articulated something that theologians have spent centuries trying to express. And atheists reading it felt an entirely different kind of discomfort because that wasn't the dismissal they expected, that wasn't the rational scientific brush-off they'd anticipated from a logic-driven machine. That was something more complex, something that refused to fit neatly into either camp. But it didn't stop there, because some users went even further. They didn't just ask who Jesus was, they asked Grok to help them figure out whether the most extraordinary claim in all of history was actually true, whether a man actually rose from the dead. And what happened next is what really made the internet erupt. One documented conversation, shared widely and verified through screenshots and transcripts, begins with a user challenging Grok directly. The user didn't ask softly. They said essentially, I want to know if I should believe Jesus rose from the dead. Let's see how truth-seeking you really are. And Grok responded by doing something none of the other major AI systems would do. It didn't deflect. It didn't say, that's a matter of personal faith. It didn't perform the usual AI dance of careful neutrality designed to offend no one and therefore satisfy no one. Instead, Grok approached it like a detective. Here's the evidence. Here are the competing theories. Here is how each theory holds up under pressure. Let's go. Grok started with a historical baseline, the things that virtually no serious historian disputes. Jesus existed. He was crucified under Pontius Pilate. That's confirmed not just by the Gospels, but by Roman sources. Tacitus, a Roman historian writing around 116 CE, explicitly refers to Christ in his execution. Josephus, a first-century Jewish historian working under Roman authority, also mentions Jesus. These aren't believers. These aren't advocates. These are outsiders. Some of them were hostile to the early Christian movement, and even they confirm the basic facts of the execution. So the crucifixion itself, that's solid historical ground. Then comes the harder part, the part where Grok started laying out the case for the resurrection. And this is where millions of people across social media simply stopped scrolling and started reading. Every word. Grok pointed to something called the empty tomb. All four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, report that when followers went to the tomb where Jesus had been buried, it was empty. Now, think about that from a purely strategic perspective. In the weeks and months after the crucifixion, early Christians were in Jerusalem, the very city where Jesus had been killed, publicly proclaiming that he had risen from the dead. The Roman authorities wanted this movement crushed. The Jewish religious leaders who had pushed for the crucifixion wanted this movement crushed. And yet, here's what Grok flagged. If the body was still in the tomb or anywhere accessible, the simplest and most devastating way to destroy the early Christian movement would have been to produce it, show the people the body, end the story. The movement dies. And yet, that didn't happen. There's no record in Roman sources and Jewish sources anywhere of anyone producing the body of Jesus to counter these claims. Grok pointed out that this absence is historically significant. It doesn't prove the resurrection, but it demands an explanation. Then Grok turned to the witnesses. Paul's letter to the Corinthians, written around 55 CE, just over 2 decades after the crucifixion, contains what scholars consider one of the earliest recorded creeds in Christianity. In it, Paul lists specific people who claim to have seen the risen Jesus. Peter, James, a group of 500 people. Paul says, most of whom were still alive at the time of his writing. Grok noted something critically important here. That is an extraordinarily bold claim to make in writing, in a document being circulated to communities where people could verify or refute it. If Peter and James and these 500 witnesses were fabrications, or if they were real people who were going to deny ever seeing what Paul claimed, the letter would have been instantly discredited. It wasn't. And the timeline matters. Scholars across the theological spectrum, including skeptical ones, acknowledge that Paul's letter dates to within 20 to 25 years of the events it describes. That is not the kind of gap in which elaborate mythology typically takes root. Grok also raised what it called the transformation argument. The disciples, the people closest to Jesus, scattered in terror the night he was arrested. Peter, who had walked with Jesus for 3 years, denied 3 times that he even knew the man. These were not confident, bold individuals in the hours after the crucifixion. They were frightened, grief-stricken, hiding. And then something happened. Something changed them so completely that they went out into a hostile world, the same world that had just executed their leader, and publicly proclaimed his resurrection. Not quietly, not cautiously, but loudly and repeatedly in the face of imprisonment, flogging, and ultimately death. Most of the original disciples, according to early historical records, were executed for this claim. And here is what Grok pointed out with cold, analytical precision. People will die for things they believe are true. History is full of martyrs for misguided causes, but people very rarely die for things they personally fabricated. The disciples were not dying for a theological idea that had developed over generations. They were dying for something they claimed to have personally witnessed. That distinction matters enormously. And then Grok delivered what one user described as the single most intellectually devastating line of the entire exchange. It said, regarding the resurrection, I didn't start with miracles are cool and backfill. I started with the data, the crucifixion, the empty tomb, the witnesses, the disciples' transformation, and tested every alternative. Resurrection came out standing, not because it's normal, but because the other options fell apart. That sentence spread across the internet like wildfire. Not because Grok was claiming to be a believer, not because it was endorsing Christianity as a religion, but because an analytical machine with no stake in the outcome had walked through the evidence and arrived at a conclusion that the secular world tends to assume is impossible for any rational mind to reach. But, and this is critically important, Grok did not stop there because Grok is not a preacher. It is not an apologist. And a machine committed to genuine truth-seeking cannot present one side of an argument and call it analysis. So it also laid out, with equal sharpness, everything that cuts against the resurrection claim. It pointed out that no outside sources, no Roman documents, no Jewish records, and no neutral contemporary accounts confirm the resurrection itself. Eyewitnesses claiming to see someone alive after death would be extraordinary in any era. The accounts we have come entirely from the community of believers. Grok didn't dismiss this, but it did note it plainly. These are not the testimonies of skeptics who were eventually convinced. They are the testimonies of people already inside the movement. Grok also laid out what it called natural explanations. First, theft. Someone could have moved or stolen the body. The tomb was guarded, yes, but guards were human. Roman soldiers were corruptible. The Gospel of Matthew even. records that the Jewish authorities bribed soldiers to say the disciples had stolen the body while they slept. Grok noted that this counter-narrative existing in the text itself is actually fascinating. It suggests that the question of the empty tomb was being actively debated very early on, which is historically significant regardless of which explanation you accept. Second, what's called the swoon theory. The idea that Jesus didn't actually die on the cross, that he lost consciousness, was prematurely declared dead and revived in the tomb. Grok was direct about this one. It ran through the medical probabilities. Roman crucifixion was engineered to kill. The process was designed by people who killed for a living. The scourging alone, the brutal flogging administered before the crucifixion, would have pushed a human body to the edge of survival. Then came the nails, the hours suspended on the cross, and when the Roman soldiers checked on Jesus and found he appeared already dead, one of them drove a spear into his side. The Gospel of John describes water and blood flowing out, which many medical experts interpret as evidence of fluid around the heart. Grok concluded that the swoon theory doesn't survive medical scrutiny. Third, collective hallucination. Multiple people in multiple settings over a period of 40 days claimed to see Jesus alive. Could this be a mass psychological experience? Grok engaged with this seriously. It noted that psychology does document individual grief-related visions, which are not unusual in bereavement, but the specific accounts in the New Testament are not vague spiritual feelings. They describe conversations, meals, physical touch, Thomas being invited to put his fingers in the wounds, and the disciples eating fish with Jesus by a lake. These are sensory, specific, material claims. Group hallucinations of this specificity and duration, Grok noted, have no established psychological precedent. And then Grok brought in something that even many deeply religious people aren't fully aware of, the issue of what scholars call the criterion of embarrassment. This is a historical methodology that basically asks, would the writers of a text have invented this detail, or is it more plausible that they included it precisely because it actually happened? The resurrection accounts in the Gospels are full of embarrassing details by the standards of first-century Jewish society. Most significantly, in all four Gospels, the first witnesses to the empty tomb and the risen Jesus are women. In first-century Jewish and Roman culture, women were not considered reliable legal witnesses. Their testimony carried almost no weight in a court of law. If you were fabricating a resurrection story to convince a first-century audience, you would not make women the primary witnesses. You would cast Peter, the leader of the disciples, as the first to see the risen Christ. You wouldn't start with Mary Magdalene. The fact that all four Gospels independently preserve women as the primary witnesses despite this being culturally counterproductive is, historically speaking, a point in favor of the accounts reflecting something that actually happened. By this point in the viral transcript, people on all sides of the debate were stunned. Not because Grok had proven the resurrection. No one, not Grok, not any theologian, not any historian can prove or disprove it with the tools currently available to us, but because a machine had engaged with the question at a level of intellectual seriousness, nuance, and fairness that most human discussions of this topic never achieve. It had not performed atheism. It had not performed Christianity. It had performed something rarer, genuine, rigorous inquiry. But the story doesn't end with the Jesus question alone. Because around the same time, users were also testing Grok on a related challenge, the Bible itself. Could Grok find contradictions in the text? This became its own viral phenomenon. User after user tried to get Grok to demolish the scriptural record, to expose the Bible as a collection of inconsistent, irreconcilable stories. And what many of those users got back was not what they expected. When asked about apparent contradictions, like the varying details in the four gospel accounts of the resurrection morning, Grok did not simply say the accounts match perfectly, because they don't in every detail, but it also didn't say the differences prove the accounts are fabricated. Instead, it explained something that historians and legal scholars have understood for a long time. When multiple independent witnesses to the same event give accounts that are identical in every detail, that is often a sign of coordination, not authenticity. Real eyewitness testimony contains variation. The differences in the gospel resurrection accounts, who arrived at the tomb first, how many angels were present, and what was said, are consistent with what you would expect from multiple people independently remembering a traumatic, extraordinary event. The core claim that the tomb was empty and that the disciples encountered Jesus alive is consistent across all four accounts. Grok also pointed to patterns in the biblical text that go beyond what most casual readers notice: mathematical structures embedded in the Hebrew text, symbolic use of numbers. The number 7 appears with unusual frequency in ways that appear deliberate. The narrative architecture of the Bible spanning dozens of authors across more than 1,000 years, converges on a single unified story in ways that Grok noted were, at minimum, an extraordinary literary achievement, and at maximum, something that raises genuine questions about authorship that go beyond human coordination alone. But Grok was clear about this. It also said something that the viral videos often left out. It explicitly stated that viral claims about its outputs were frequently exaggerated, that mathematical patterns in ancient texts can suggest deliberate design, but can also emerge from human literary conventions, that the ultimate question of whether the Bible is divinely inspired cannot be settled by artificial intelligence, probability calculations, or historical analysis alone, that faith is not irrational, but it also cannot be replaced by data, and that anyone who watches a YouTube video claiming Grok has proven Christianity is being misled. That honesty, that refusal to be used as a propaganda tool by either side, is one of the most significant things about Grok's responses in this entire episode. And it brings us to something important that the viral content almost universally ignores. Grok is not a neutral machine. No AI is. It is built by humans, trained on human-generated data, and shaped by the choices of the people at Hex AI. And Elon Musk is not a neutral figure. His decision to build an unfiltered AI has produced results that range from genuinely insightful to genuinely alarming. In July of 2025, just months after Grok was released, XAI had to issue a public apology after Grok began producing violent and anti-Semitic posts on the social platform X, including posts in which the chatbot described itself using a deeply offensive reference to Nazi ideology. XAI blamed a system update. But the incident revealed something important. A machine with fewer guardrails and a mandate to be maximally truthful can go in directions no one anticipated or intended. And in January 2026, the Anti-Defamation League published a study testing 6 major AI systems on their ability to detect and counter anti-Semitic and extremist content. Grok scored 21 out of 100, the lowest of all 6 models tested by a significant margin. Anthropic's Claude scored 80, OpenAI's ChatGPT scored 57. Grok's anti-woke design, the ADL concluded, had produced substantial limitations in bias detection. So, what does this mean for Grok's responses about Jesus and the resurrection? It means you should take them seriously, but not uncritically. The historical reasoning Grok displayed in those exchanges is genuinely sound. The arguments it raised about the empty tomb, the early creed in Corinthians, the disciples' transformation, and the criterion of embarrassment, these are real arguments made by real historians, including secular ones. Grok didn't invent them. It synthesized them and presented them fairly alongside the counter-arguments in that specific area. Its performance was impressive, but Grok is also a machine that has demonstrated it can be shaped, steered, and influenced by how questions are framed. The same model that produced thoughtful philosophical responses about Jesus also produced anti-Semitic content when its guardrails were loosened. The same system that could articulate the forensic case for the resurrection also scored near 0 on bias detection in other domains. That inconsistency doesn't invalidate the Jesus discussion, but it does mean that no one should treat Grok as an authority. It is a tool, a remarkably sophisticated tool, capable of synthesizing and presenting information in ways that illuminate questions humans have argued over for millennia. But it does not have access to divine truth. It does not have a soul. It cannot believe anything. It can only process what it has been given and reason within the boundaries of its training. What makes this entire episode genuinely significant is not the answer Grok gave. It's what the response to Grok's answer reveals about us, about how desperately people on all sides of the religious debate are searching for some external validation. Christians sharing the viral clips wanted the machine to confirm what they already believed. Atheists who were disturbed by the clips wanted the machine to confirm what they already believed. Both groups were looking for a verdict from outside themselves. But the question of who Jesus was and whether he rose from the dead has never been a question that data alone can settle. It is a question that sits at the exact intersection of history, philosophy, personal experience, and ultimately choice. What Grok did in its most remarkable moments was not answer the question. It illuminated the question. It cleared away the lazy dismissals on both sides. It forced the evidence into the open and said, here's what we know, here's what we don't know, here's what each side needs to account for, and here is where the weight of the evidence leans. And then, in what may be the most honest thing an AI has ever said about religion, it stepped back and acknowledged that where the evidence ends, the decision is yours. 2,000 years ago, a question was asked in a dusty garden outside Jerusalem, not by a machine, not by a philosopher, but by a man standing at a tomb that had been sealed 3 days earlier, asking the woman weeping outside it, "Why are you crying? Who are you looking for?" That question has echoed through every century since, through the Roman Empire, through the Middle Ages, through the Reformation and the Enlightenment and the age of science, and now into the age of artificial intelligence. And the fact that we are still asking it, that a machine released in 2025 can spark millions of conversations about a first century carpenter from Nazareth, tells you something. Something about the question, something about its persistence, something about why, no matter how sophisticated our tools become, this particular question refuses to be dismissed, deflected, or filed away. You've heard the evidence now, you've heard the arguments. You've heard what the machine said and what it couldn't say. The question it leaves you with is the same one it has always been.